Initial opposition to Hamilton's program came from the South, which lacked investors and owners of government bonds, where support for manufacturing and a diversified economy was weak. The South was all about plantations, slaves, cotton, rice, tobacco, and indigo. Cash crops, no diversity there, either in the crops or the people. And whose states had paid off much of their war debt. So, again, they didn't want to be taxed by the national government to pay off the debt of states who were not responsible enough in their mind to have paid them off already. Hamilton argued that the Constitution's clause giving Congress the power to enact laws for the general welfare authorized his plans, and they were the loose constructionists. Here it is. Hamilton argued that just because it isn't explicitly in the Constitution does not mean we don't have the right to do it. For example, the elastic clause that said Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper for the general welfare of the United States to carry out its functions. And Hamilton said, yeah, there's no national bank in the Constitution, but it does say we can collect taxes and raise an army, and how can we best do that? By having an institution that can take care of our money, the Bank of the United States. So it's implied. It's an implied power. So they are a loose constructionist, interpreting the Constitution loosely, letting it expand. On the other side, Jeffersonians, they were the strict constructionists. If it didn't say it, you can't do it. They argued that the federal government could only use powers that were explicitly in the Constitution, which they charged did not authorize a national bank. A compromise between Jefferson and Hamilton secured Hamilton's fiscal program, his reports, minus the subsidies for the factories, like I mentioned, in exchange for locating the nation's capital between Virginia and Maryland, and that became D.C. It was the dinner table bargain. And here was the agreement. Hamilton agreed that if Southerners voted for Hamilton's plan, he would push for a national capital in the South, which became D.C. So that was a trade-off. Jefferson said, okay, Hamilton, you can have your plans if we can have the capital down south. He wound up regretting this dinner table bargain. So 1790, Hamilton's financial plan is approved, and the national capital is moved to an area between Maryland and Virginia along the Potomac River called the District of Columbia. All right, interpreting the Constitution. And by the way, we are now on our way towards capitalism. All right, interpreting the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison argued that the national bank was unconstitutional. They claimed the Constitution did not allow for a national bank. Hamilton had a more flexible interpretation of the Constitution. Remember, he was a loose constructionist. He claims the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, gave the Congress the power. Hamilton persuades Washington and Congress to approve it, and he gets his bank by 1791. So we had the first bus, which eventually, again, gets destroyed by Jefferson. Okay, political parties. You see a picture of Washington leading his troops into the military against our own people. Okay, so by the mid-1790s, two parties appeared in Congress, calling themselves Federalist and Republicans. Both parties claimed the language of American liberty, and each accused the other of conspiring to destroy that liberty. So they each claimed that they were the correct vision of what America wanted to and should become. The Federalists supported the Washington administration, they favored Hamilton's economic program, and they wanted closer ties with Britain. They were made up of well-to-do merchants, bigger farmers, lawyers, established political leaders, especially in the North. They tended to be the Federalists. They were generally elitist, and they saw society as a fixed hierarchy in which political office should go to wealthy men who expected deference from lesser men. Think the military officer and George Hughes in the Tea Party etiquette video. They wanted to go back to that. They feared that the spirit of liberty generated by the Revolution was degenerating into anarchy, too much democracy. When armed frontier farmers in Pennsylvania tried to prevent the collection of the whiskey tax out by Pittsburgh in 1794, invoking the language of the Revolution and liberty, they said they were following in the footsteps of the Revolution. Washington dispatched troops to the region to suppress them. The rebels offered no resistance, and the rebellion reinforced Federalist fear of popular democracy. The Constitution had passed its first test. The Articles nearly failed. When the Articles were our governing document, the national government was kind of unable to put down Shays' rebellion. The elite freaked out. They passed the Constitution. I mean, again, I'm oversimplifying it there, but the Constitution was passed. First test, Whiskey Rebellion. Can the government put down a rebellion? Yes, it can. Alright. It was the only time in U.S. history that the president commanded an army in the field. Alright, let's get to the Republican Party. Looking at the notes. The Republicans, again, in opposition to the Federalists and the Hamiltonians, they were the same party. The Republicans, led by Madison and Jefferson, seemed to embrace popular politics. They had less of a fear of the common person, whereas the Federalists did have this fear of the common person. They supported France in the French Revolution, and they had more faith in democratic self-government. Southern planters, ordinary farmers around the country, and urban artisans who sympathized with the French Revolution supported this party. They were far more critical of social and economic inequality, and more congenial to broad democratic participation by the ordinary Americans than the Federalists were. Again, they had less of a fear of the common person. Each party believed that only itself was legitimate and representative of all the nations, deemed an illegitimate faction and enemy of American liberty and the Revolution's principles. So the Anti-Federalists, who were against ratification of the Constitution, didn't go away once the Constitution was ratified. They said, hey, all these things we fear, we're not going to let them happen. We're going to try to stop them from happening. So the Anti-Federalists morphed into, more or less, the Jeffersonian or Republican Party, or Democrat-Republican Party. Jefferson and his followers thought the French Revolution, despite its extremism, was a victory for self-government everywhere. To Washington and Hamilton and their followers, the Revolution invited anarchy, and they believed America should befriend Britain, but since the Revolution, the U.S. had been a permanent ally of France. Remember, we had an alliance with them. They helped us win the war. But he also moved to expel a French envoy, Edmond Genet, for trying to recruit American ships to attack British vessels. So the Washington's government wasn't so rah-rah about France, but the American people, at first, were very supportive of France, and Genet was over here trying to recruit Americans to fight for France, and Washington didn't like that, tried to have him expelled, didn't work, he stayed here, he eventually never left, he stayed here and married and had a family, a lot of kids. At the same time, Britain seized American ships and sailors. John Jay negotiated a controversial treaty. The odd name, it was called Jay's Treaty. That effectively canceled the American-French alliance and recognized British commercial and naval supremacy. This, and I'm yelling this is why it's cap lock, this was highly criticized by Jeffersonians as capitulating to England, giving in to them, and directly led to the formation of the Republican Party, that was opposed to the Federalists, that negotiated the Jay Treaty. Alright, expanding public sphere. The partisanship of the 1790s expanded the public sphere and the democratic content of American freedom. It increased the number of citizens who attended political events and read newspapers. Literacy was quite high. Ordinary men, never before active in politics, wrote pamphlets. Deference was over, or was crumbling, and organized political meetings. Newspapers and pamphlets were a primary vehicle for political debate in the early republic. These men included members of, and this is important, the Democratic Republican societies, inspired by the Jacobin clubs of Paris. They were highly critical of the Washington administration. They openly supported the French Revolution, and they praised American and French liberty. Federalists viewed them as illegitimately usurping the representative authority of the government. Washington dismissed them as self-created societies. And remember, so in power were the Federalists, out of power were the Jeffersonians, many of whom were these Democrat-Republican societies who published pamphlets and newspapers. Remember that for when we get to the Adams presentation. So they justified their existence by claiming that the people had a right to debate political questions and organize to influence government policy. They believed political liberty involved more than just voting. What a novel idea. And included popular organizing and pressure tactics too. You mean they got off the couch? Although the society soon disappeared, they were absorbed by the emerging Republican Party, which also found support among radical British immigrants who defended the French Revolution, such as Thomas Paine. Alright, 1792 election results. So George Washington was re-elected in 1792 for a second term. but he decided to retire from public life in 1796 and set a precedent that the presidency should not be a lifelong office. And here is a very important thing. In his farewell address, Washington warned against political parties, even though he was an independent technically, but most of his policies were quite federalist. Nonetheless, he warned against political parties and partisanship, and he urged Americans to avoid Europe's power politics by refusing to embrace, quote, permanent alliances with other nations, like France, for example. All right? So he didn't want us to get into the European affairs and get stuck in their kind of drama. Okay? So you can see Washington winning, Adams becoming the VP again, and George Clinton, not of the Parliament Funkadelics, a different George Clinton. Thomas Jefferson coming in fourth. Aaron Burr, you'll see his name all throughout the unit. He's trying for so long to become president. Washington wins. All right, and as you can see, it was almost unanimous. Almost unanimous. There was one electoral vote who was not for Washington. Actually, 3 electoral votes that were not for Washington. All right, so don't forget to take the quiz that will pop up right now.